The investors gathered closer around the flagship model as Daniel gestured toward the sleek black vehicle positioned beneath bright showroom lights, its polished surface reflecting every confident movement he made. And as he spoke about performance metrics, proprietary systems, and flawless engineering, the room leaned in, drawn by the certainty in his voice, because confidence at that level often replaced the need for proof. Emily remained where she was, her gaze fixed not on Daniel, but on the vehicle's diagnostic interface subtly glowing through the dashboard display, a faint flicker that most would mistake for routine calibration. Yet her eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing a timing inconsistency that did not belong in a system claiming precision down to the millisecond. One of the junior technicians approached her cautiously, lowering his voice as if speaking too loudly might draw unwanted attention, asking if she needed help finding her way out. But Emily simply shook her head, her focus unbroken, and replied quietly that she was exactly where she needed to be. Across the room, Daniel's laughter rose again as one of the investors joked about trusting machines more than people, and Daniel responded with a confident remark about how his systems eliminated human error entirely, a statement that drew approving nods and light applause, the kind that comes easily when money is about to move. Emily finally stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a calm that contrasted sharply with the polished urgency of the room, her boots making soft, deliberate sounds against the marble floor as a few heads turned, confused by her presence in a space clearly not designed for someone dressed like her. She stopped just outside the circle of investors and spoke in a voice that was steady, clear, and impossible to ignore once heard, pointing out that the system's synchronization was off by a fraction that would not matter under normal conditions, but could cascade under stress. And for a brief second, the room held its breath, not because they understood her words, but because of the quiet certainty with which she delivered them. Daniel turned slowly, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to open amusement, the corners of his eyes tightening as he looked her up and down, taking in the oil-stained sleeves, the worn boots, the absence of anything that signaled authority in his world. And then he smiled, not kindly, but with the casual dismissal of someone who had already decided her value. He asked her, loud enough for everyone to hear, whether she had somehow wandered in from the service bay and mistaken a billion-dollar demonstration for a repair shop, and the room responded exactly as he expected, a ripple of restrained laughter spreading among the investors, some polite, some genuine, all reinforcing the hierarchy that placed him at the top. Emily did not react to the laughter. She did not raise her voice or defend herself. She simply met his gaze and repeated, with the same calm tone, that the system would fail under load if not corrected, and that the fix was simple, a minor adjustment to the timing sequence that would stabilize the entire operation. Daniel exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head as if indulging a harmless distraction, then turned back to his audience and waved a dismissive hand, saying that innovation did not come from guesswork, and certainly not from someone who had no understanding of the technology being presented. And with that, he signaled for the demonstration to continue, effectively closing the door on her words. Emily stood there for one more second, just long enough to confirm what she already knew. Then she nodded once, not to Daniel, but to herself, and stepped back toward the edge of the room, her expression unchanged, her mind already moving ahead to the moment when certainty would no longer belong to the loudest voice in the room, but to the quiet truth no one had been willing to hear. The demonstration resumed as if nothing had happened, but something subtle had shifted in the air, something that no one could quite name, yet everyone could feel, like a faint tension beneath polished confidence. Daniel continued speaking with measured authority, guiding the investors through the system's capabilities, his voice steady, controlled, each word reinforcing the illusion of perfection that had already been accepted as truth. And as he signaled for the live diagnostic sequence to begin, a large display illuminated behind the vehicle, lines of data streaming smoothly across the screen, each metric aligning exactly as expected, drawing nods of approval from the observers who saw only confirmation of what they had already chosen to believe. Emily stood near the edge of the room, partially obscured by a structural column, her posture relaxed but her eyes fixed on the data feed. tracking every fluctuation with quiet precision. And while the numbers appeared flawless to the untrained eye, she noticed the same fractional delay she had pointed out earlier, repeating itself in perfect disguise, hidden within the system's synchronization cycle, small enough to be ignored, yet persistent enough to grow under pressure. One of the senior investors stepped forward, asking about scalability and real-world application under high demand, and Daniel responded without hesitation, explaining that the system had been tested under conditions exceeding any realistic scenario, his tone carrying the kind of certainty that discouraged further questioning, because doubt had no place in a room built on confidence. The technician operating the system initiated a stress simulation at Daniel's request, the numbers on the display accelerating, data streams intensifying. And for a moment, everything appeared exactly as promised, stable, controlled, precise, and a few approving smiles began to form among the investors, the kind that precede decisions worth millions. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her gaze narrowing as the system approached the threshold she had already calculated in her mind, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her toolbox as if grounding herself in something real, while the room placed its faith in something fragile. Daniel glanced briefly toward the investors, reading their reactions, sensing the deal already within reach, and allowed himself a small, confident smile, the same expression that had accompanied his earlier laughter, as if the outcome had never been in question. Then, for a fraction of a second, something changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice immediately, but enough for the rhythm of the data to lose its perfect alignment, a single metric hesitating before correcting itself, then another following with the same subtle delay, like a heartbeat skipping just once before trying to recover. The technician frowned slightly, adjusting his posture, his eyes scanning the display more carefully now, while Daniel's smile held for a moment longer than it should have, as if refusing to acknowledge what had not yet fully revealed itself. Emily did not move, did not react, because she had already seen this moment before it arrived, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she were watching something inevitable unfold rather than something unexpected. The room grew quieter, not silent, but quieter in a way that signaled attention shifting from confidence to observation, and although no one spoke, the certainty that had filled the space began to thin, replaced by something far less comfortable. The first trace of doubt. Daniel cleared his throat softly, preparing to continue, to regain control of the narrative before the moment could take on meaning. But the system was no longer perfectly in sync, and for the first time since the demonstration began, control no longer belonged entirely to him. The service bay felt like a different world the moment Emily stepped inside. The polished marble replaced by concrete floors marked with years of real work, the scent of oil and metal lingering in the air, and the sounds here were honest, tools clinking, engines cooling, quiet conversations between technicians who understood machines better than presentations. She set her toolbox down on a worn workbench, the familiar weight grounding her, as if the entire showroom scene had already passed into memory, something observed rather than experienced. Behind her, Daniel's presence did not follow immediately, and for a moment, the distance between their worlds returned, but not in the same way it had before, because now that distance carried awareness. Emily reached for a diagnostic tablet resting near the bench, tapping through system logs she had accessed earlier, her eyes scanning the same synchronization pattern that had revealed itself under pressure, confirming again what she already knew, that the flaw was not dramatic, not obvious, but fundamental, a misalignment that no amount of confidence could override. Footsteps approached, measured but no longer commanding, and Daniel stopped just inside the threshold of the service area, his gaze adjusting to the different environment, the absence of spectacle, the presence of substance, and for the first time that day, he did not immediately speak, as if understanding that whatever he said next needed to carry more weight than authority. Emily did not turn right away, finishing her review before placing the tablet down. Then she faced him, her expression unchanged, neither welcoming nor dismissive, simply present. Daniel's voice came quieter than it had in the showroom, stripped of performance, asking if the issue could be fixed, not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine request, and the difference was clear. Because this time, he was not asking to confirm what he already believed. He was asking because he no longer knew. Emily considered him for a brief moment, not measuring his status, but his willingness to listen. And then she answered that the flaw was small, but it required understanding the system beyond what it was designed to show, that it was not about rewriting everything, but about correcting the timing at its core, aligning processes that had been forced into precision instead of allowed to achieve it. Daniel stepped closer, his attention fixed on her explanation, following each word with a focus that had not been present earlier, because now the stakes were not theoretical, they were real, measured in lost opportunity and the quiet shift of trust. Emily moved to a nearby console, pulling up the system interface, her fingers navigating through layers of code and parameters with ease, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, and she pointed to the exact point where the delay originated, explaining how the loop compensated too late, how the correction needed to anticipate rather than react, her tone steady, clear, without the need to impress. Daniel watched, not interrupting, his earlier confidence replaced by attention, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are seeing something they should have noticed sooner. The hum of the service bay continued around them, unchanged, indifferent to the shift taking place, because here, value was not determined by appearance or title, but by whether something worked. Emily made a small adjustment, nothing dramatic, just a recalibration of the timing sequence, then stepped back, allowing the system to process the change, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence now different from before, not heavy with doubt, but focused, waiting. Daniel glanced at the screen, then back at her, and in that exchange, the roles had quietly reversed, because the person he had dismissed was now the one holding the answer, and the only thing left uncertain was whether he would recognize its worth before it was too late. The system processed the adjustment without resistance, the interface responding with a quiet shift in timing that was almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. And Emily watched the synchronization loop carefully, her eyes tracking the sequence as it recalibrated itself from reaction to anticipation, the delay no longer chasing the error, but moving ahead of it, aligning the system in a way that felt natural rather than forced. Daniel leaned slightly closer to the screen, his focus sharpened, searching for the same inconsistencies that had cost him everything just hours earlier. But this time the data flowed differently, smoother, each metric holding its place without hesitation, and although the change was subtle, the difference was undeniable to anyone willing to see it. The hum of the service bay continued around them, unchanged, grounding the moment in reality, while the showroom beyond remained quiet, its earlier energy replaced by absence, as if the space itself was waiting for something to restore its purpose. Emily stepped back once the sequence stabilized, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the workbench, not claiming the result, not announcing it, simply allowing it to exist as proof on its own. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension he had carried since the failed demonstration releasing just enough for clarity to take its place. And for the first time that day, he did not try to explain what he was seeing. He simply acknowledged it, his voice low as he said that the system was holding, not as a statement of pride, but as recognition of fact. Emily nodded once, confirming without embellishment, explaining that the system had never been broken, only misaligned, that it had been designed to correct after failure instead of preventing it. And that small difference was what had created the instability under pressure. Daniel absorbed her words in silence, his mind replaying the earlier demonstration, the exact moment when the delay had first appeared, realizing now that it had been predictable, avoidable, and most importantly, pointed out to him before it mattered. He glanced at her again, this time not measuring her appearance, but the precision of her understanding, and the shift in his perspective was no longer subtle, it was complete. One of the technicians nearby approached cautiously, having noticed the stabilized output on the screen, and asked if the system could be run again under full load, his tone careful, aware that something significant had changed. Daniel looked at Emily, not issuing a command, but waiting, and she gave a slight nod, her confidence quiet but certain, and that was enough. The technician initiated the simulation once more, the data building gradually, then accelerating, climbing toward the same threshold that had exposed the flaw before. And this time, there was no hesitation, no delay, just a consistent alignment that held steady as the load increased. the system performing exactly as it had been promised, but now with substance behind the claim. Daniel watched the display, his reflection no longer framed by uncertainty, but by something more grounded, something earned rather than assumed. And as the simulation reached its peak without deviation, the silence that followed was different from before, not heavy with doubt, but filled with quiet confirmation. Emily turned slightly toward the exit, her role in the moment already complete in her mind, because she had never been there to prove anything, only to correct what needed to be understood. And as she reached for her toolbox again, Daniel spoke once more, his voice steady but changed, asking her to stay, not as a demand, but as a recognition that the outcome he had lost might still have a path forward, if he was willing to listen this time instead of laugh. Emily paused at the edge of the service bay, her hand resting lightly on the handle of her worn toolbox as Daniel's words settled into the space between them, and for a moment, the steady hum of the shop seemed to fade beneath the quiet weight of what he was asking, not just for her to stay, but for something far less familiar to him, the willingness to accept what he had once dismissed. She turned slightly, her expression calm, measuring not his position but his intent, and in that brief glance, it became clear that whatever came next would not be decided by status or urgency, but by understanding. Daniel took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to show he was no longer speaking from across a divide, his voice steady but stripped of the sharp certainty that had defined it earlier, explaining that the investors would not return without proof, that the system needed to demonstrate not just performance but reliability, and that what she had done in minutes had revealed more than his entire presentation. Emily listened without interruption, her posture relaxed but attentive, and when he finished, she responded simply that systems do not fail because they are weak, they fail because they are misunderstood, and that fixing them requires more than correcting numbers, it requires respecting how they behave under pressure. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the words not as advice but as correction, his gaze shifting briefly toward the console where the stabilized data still held steady, a quiet reminder of what had already been proven. One of the technicians approached again, this time with less hesitation, informing Daniel that the system was ready to be recorded under full load, that they could capture a clean demonstration if they acted quickly, and the opportunity, though smaller than before, was still there, waiting to be recognized. Daniel looked back at Emily, not issuing instructions, but asking without words whether the system would hold beyond this moment, whether what she had corrected would remain consistent, and she gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not emphasized, but certain, the kind of certainty that does not need repetition. The technician initiated the recording sequence, the system building once more toward peak load, the data rising in controlled progression, each metric aligning with quiet precision. And this time, there was no hesitation, no delay, only a steady flow that held its structure even as the demand increased, the correction no longer visible as a fix, but integrated as part of the system itself. Daniel watched closely, not with the detached confidence of earlier, but with focused attention, his understanding now tied to what he could see rather than what he assumed. And as the simulation reached its highest threshold without deviation, he exhaled slowly, the realization settling in that what had nearly been lost could still be recovered, not through presentation, but through truth. Emily stepped back, allowing the moment to exist without her presence at its center, because she had never been there to take credit, only to ensure that what was built actually worked. The recording completed, the technician confirming that the data was clean, consistent, and ready to be presented. And for the first time since the investors had left, the room held a different kind of silence, one that carried possibility instead of doubt. Daniel turned toward Emily again, his expression no longer defined by control, but by recognition, understanding now that the outcome ahead would depend not on how well he spoke, but on how well he listened. And in that moment, the balance between them had fully shifted, not in power, but in perspective, because the answer he needed had never been hidden. It had simply been standing quietly in front of him, waiting to be heard. The showroom lights were still on when Daniel stepped back into the main floor, but the energy that once filled the space had changed, no longer driven by anticipation, but by quiet urgency, the kind that follows a mistake that cannot be erased but might still be corrected. The recording file rested on a tablet in his hand, its clean data now representing something far more valuable than the polished presentation he had relied on earlier. And as he stood there for a moment, he understood that what he had lost was not just a deal, but the illusion that control alone was enough. Behind him, Emily remained in the service bay, not stepping forward, not claiming the moment, her presence steady and distant, as if she had already returned to the rhythm of her own work, leaving the outcome to unfold without her needing to guide it further. Daniel glanced back once, just long enough to acknowledge her without words, then turned his attention forward, because what came next required more than recognition, it required action. He moved toward his office with measured steps, the quiet echo of his shoes against the marble no longer announcing authority, but intention, and inside, he placed the tablet on the desk, pulling up the investor contacts with a focus that had nothing to do with persuasion and everything to do with proof. The call connected faster than he expected, the lead investor's voice calm, professional, but distant, already shifted away from commitment, and Daniel did not begin with explanation. He did not defend what had happened. He simply stated that the system had been corrected, that a full load demonstration had been recorded, and that the data would speak for itself. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but enough to measure interest against hesitation, and then the investor agreed to review the material, not promising anything, not reopening the deal, just allowing the possibility to exist again. Daniel ended the call without adding more, because he understood now that words had already reached their limit, and what remained would depend on what could be proven, not what could be said. Outside his office, the showroom remained quiet, staff moving with a different kind of awareness, their earlier confidence replaced by careful attention, as if the entire space had learned something without being told. Emily's absence from the main floor was noticeable now, not because she had ever stood at the center, but because